There are mornings that seem ordinary, yet quietly divide one life from another. That day. I stood in the meeting room on the 14th floor of Delos Media, looking through the clear glass at the streets of Manhattan, just waking up. The coffee in my hand had long gone cold, but I clung to it as if its last trace of warmth could keep me steady for what was about to unfold. My name is Katy Perry, not the stage icon, but a 34-year-old woman behind the lights, someone who spent nearly a decade crafting emotional media campaigns for others, never once appearing on screen, never asking for recognition, simply working with the faith that real value would be seen through action. I used to believe that hard work, ethical conduct, and loyalty would be acknowledged. I believed that for 8 years at Delos, a place I once called family. I started as an unpaid intern, doing everything from writing content for small brands to building slides overnight for major pitches. In my second year, I was offered a full-time role. By the third, I was managing clients. In the fifth, I was the force behind the runaway success of Feel More, Sell Less, a campaign for a fragrance brand that marked the first time emotional marketing became the company's survival mantra. Yet, it was Madison Green, the newly hired creative director, always polished, always camera-ready, who was praised in front of the press. She knew how to speak, how to match lipstick shades to the time of day, how to find the best light in any frame. I told myself not to care, because what I cared about was results. The campaign brought Delos Media a national award and a string of lucrative contracts, and I was promoted to director of strategy, though the announcement stayed internal with no flowers, no press. Still, it felt like progress, until I began to realize I was being pushed out in increments I barely noticed. It started with a major project called Heartline, a brand campaign for a mental wellness platform aimed at young women. I was chosen to lead, responsible for overseeing content, video production, and the entire media strategy over 6 months. I lived in the office most nights, missed my mother's birthday, and lost a 2-year relationship because I had neither the time nor energy left to love. I believed Heartline would be a turning point, not just for the company, but for my career, a place to fully express both the empathy and creative depth I had honed over the years. But 1 week before the official launch, when everything was nearly complete, I was summoned into a private meeting with the CEO and Madison. The air felt like someone had drained the oxygen from the room. On the table lay a contract transferring project leadership to Madison, citing the need for a face better suited for the public phase. I heard every word like paper tearing through my self-respect. They said I built the structure well, but now someone with influence should be the one to represent it publicly. I tried to stay calm, asked for the real reason, and when I looked into Madison's eyes, I understood she had planned this all along. Every time she told me, "Let me handle the presentation," every time she subtly shifted direction or brought in someone from her personal network, it was all intentional. I was just the bridge she used to step into the spotlight. I left that room without signing anything, though I knew I couldn't stop what was already in motion. The next day, the first article about Heartline ran on the front page of Ad Age, and Madison stood at its center under the headline, "The woman behind the most inspiring campaign of the year." I read every word inside my office, the one where I had taped mood boards and revised copy till midnight. I remembered the warm glow of the desk lamp on my cold coffee, remembered my hands trembling from exhaustion as I typed the final lines of creative. But no one in that article remembered me. I had been erased from the story I wrote. 3 days later, I was asked to step back from future projects under the guise of rest and role realignment. I understood it for what it was, a gentle dismissal. I packed my things in silence, taking with me a photo my mother had sent when I was made full-time, and a folder of campaigns that had been rejected for being too emotional, not commercial enough. That night, I stood in my small Brooklyn apartment, staring out the window where subway lights flickered against old brick walls, and for the first time in years, I didn't know what I would do tomorrow. I had believed in that company like a family, had given myself to it with everything I had, thinking I was valued for my work. But in the end, I was just a name easily left out of a larger strategy. The fall didn't come from one hard shove, but from a quiet erosion, step by unseen step. And when I finally realized it, I was already at the bottom. No title, no recognition, no way forward, just a hollow stillness, like the office door closing behind me that day, quiet, sharp, and final like a period at the end of a sentence. At first, I had no idea where to begin again. The first few days after leaving Delos felt like all sound had been drained from my world. I woke up late, brewed coffee only to let it grow cold, sat in front of my laptop for hours without opening a single file. A part of me still waited for an apology email, a call from management explaining it had all been a misunderstanding, or at the very least, someone from the old company saying they regretted letting me go. But there was nothing, just silence, a kind of silence so deep it swallowed whatever remnants of belief I still had. I felt like a line of code removed from the system, no error, no alert, simply no longer running. Then one morning, when sunlight touched the desk where I used to jot down notes, I noticed a Post-it stuck to the back of my laptop. It was my handwriting from the year before. It said, "Real value doesn't need PR, just persistence." I remembered writing that after an idea had been rejected for being too emotional, not commercially viable. And it was that same day I started collecting my drafts into a folder called For Later. That morning, I opened that folder again. Each file appeared like dusted fragments of trust I had forgotten. There were campaign proposals for small brands, video scripts that were never approved, and market research essays on sustainable emotional marketing in an era of information overload. I read them not as someone chasing a dream, but as someone who had been betrayed. And for the first time, they didn't seem naive anymore. They looked like opportunity. I started piecing together every concept, every bit of copy, every slide deck into a single document, and I called it Northlight. It was a name I had come up with long ago, meant to evoke a guiding light in cold terrain. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I knew if I didn't start, I would stay stuck at the bottom. The problem was, I had no investors, no team, no network strong enough to lean on. What I did have was a skill set carved from hands-on experience, a list of former clients who had quietly praised me, and a very clear realization that if I didn't stand up for myself, no one else would. I spent 2 weeks finalizing the concept, building a simple website on a free platform, and rewriting my entire portfolio in a voice that was not boastful, but focused on the tangible value each of my past campaigns had created. I sent personal emails to a few former partners, not asking for jobs, just sharing that I was launching my own initiative and open to small projects if they believed in the work. Replies came slowly, but one came from Colin, a media director at a mental health startup who had once been a Delos client. He remembered me. He said he had felt uneasy seeing me pushed off the Heartline campaign, and now he needed a product launch strategy. Though his budget was tight, I didn't negotiate. I simply asked, "What value do you need most from a partner?" he said. "I need someone who understands that mental health can't be advertised through forced smiles and piano tracks." I took the project. I handled nearly everything strategy, copywriting, and 3 short videos shot with a rented secondhand camera. I hired a newly graduated freelance editor and paid her on time despite my budget. The launch was quiet, but received warmly by the online community, not because of flashy visuals, but because of its sincerity. The first comments weren't the usual great ad kind. They said things like, "This video reached me," or "Whoever made this gets what I'm feeling." I said nothing about myself, just quietly updated the campaign metrics in my case study. A week later, Colin introduced me to 2 friends in the public service sector, and they referred others. The name Northlight started showing up in a few sustainable marketing forums. I didn't speak out, didn't step onto any stage, but I was steadily present behind each quiet success. Still, success never comes without resistance. After the 4th project, a former freelancer accused me of stealing her script idea for a video. It was completely false. But the allegation caused a major educational brand to back out of a contract, fearing public backlash. I panicked that night, not from fear of a damaged reputation, but from the fear that a few more pushes like that could dismantle the fragile structure I had just begun to build. I wanted to quit. I wanted to call Colin and ask for a stable, full-time job. But then I remembered the messages from users saying things like, "Thanks to the Northlight video." I had the courage to visit a therapist for the first time. Or, "This didn't feel like an ad. It felt like someone reaching out at the right moment." I knew then that I couldn't let a stumble undo what I had started. I spent that entire week drafting apology letters to partners, transparently detailing my video production process, engaging the former freelancer in civil dialogue, and documenting all evidence legally to protect myself. Though drained, I didn't let emotion override logic. The issue passed, but it left me with a lesson carved deep: being right doesn't shield you from harm. In media, trust can vanish, not because you were wrong, but because you didn't speak up fast enough. From that point on, I knew that beyond creativity, I had to learn how to defend my own presence. And if success as revenge is a kind of quiet warfare, then I would not fight with fury, but with unwavering consistency. There is something strange that happens when you begin to step out of the shadow. Others once placed you in the silence around you, stops being a refuge, and starts becoming a quiet tremor that makes those once in the brightest light feel uneasy. I started to notice this when an anonymous article appeared on LinkedIn, addressing abuse of power and plagiarism in the media industry. It subtly referenced the Heartline campaign as a textbook case of shameless credit theft wrapped in pretty language. The post spread quickly. It offered no direct evidence, but included enough detail for those in the field to understand who was who. Madison's name wasn't mentioned, but several comments began to question the narrative, some even citing the old press coverage and asking, was she really the one behind it? I didn't know who had written the post. I didn't like or comment, but I watched as the shares climbed each hour. It wasn't my doing, but it wasn't a surprise to anyone who had been quietly wronged for too long. And when doubt began to take root, everything they had once said started to be viewed in a different light, no longer glowing, but exposed. At that time, I was preparing for Northlight's first large-scale collaboration, a project with a nonprofit supporting women who had survived emotional abuse. The project was called Tell Me Again, a series of short films inspired by real letters women had written but never sent. It was a nonprofit effort with no promotional budget, but we decided to release it through a new streaming platform that was actively seeking high-quality social content. The first 3 episodes aired on a quiet Thursday evening. None of us expected anything, but the next morning, the video appeared in the platform's must-watch section with the caption, "You won't believe this is a media campaign. Clips began spreading across social networks. One line, every unspoken apology is a silent dagger, became the most shared quote of the week. Then, I received an unexpected email from a reporter at Bright Voice asking to interview a representative from Tell Me Again. I declined to appear on camera and instead suggested Haley, our new writer who had scripted the series, instructing her to focus only on the message and not mention me. The article ran 2 days later. The headline wasn't sensational, but it was striking enough when media doesn't sell, but heals. In the comments section, there were floods of thank yous, personal stories, and, most notably, the repeated question, "Who's behind this campaign?" That was when Madison finally spoke up. She posted a long Instagram story recounting her leadership on the Heartline campaign, calling it a defining, inspirational moment for female creatives. What she didn't expect was that, right then, a detailed article appeared on Brand Ethic, a media-focused blog, breaking down the Heartline campaign from strategy to content. It highlighted the disconnect between its branding and real market impact, subtly comparing Heartline with Tell Me Again. It never said which was better, but it laid out data on engagement, viewer retention, and actual user feedback. This time, the industry paid attention. The speculation turned into professional scrutiny. For the first time, I was invited to speak at a small conference in Portland on healing-focused communication. The invitation included a note that read, "We know you prefer not to be on stage, but if you could share your voice, it would be more valuable than any slide." I brought my campaign plan unedited, complete, and stood for the first time on a stage before more than 100 people, including familiar faces from those old Delos meetings. I didn't speak about the past. I talked about how ideas rooted in genuine emotion resonate most deeply, how those labeled as too sensitive for media often understand the audience best. I said that in an age where attention is currency, sincerity is worth 10 times more. The talk wasn't recorded, but each sentence was written down by those in the audience. The next day, I got a call from a major content firm in Seattle inviting me to consult on a series of social impact projects. Almost simultaneously, I heard that Madison had been suspended from her role as creative director at Delos after an internal review revealed she had used unverified materials in a recent presentation. I didn't feel joy or revenge, just a quiet release of something heavy I had been carrying. But that wasn't the final crescendo. A few days later, I received an email with the simple subject line, "About the truth." It was from Erica, Madison's former senior assistant at Delos, someone who had once been a close friend but had cut ties after I left. She told me she still had the original Heartline campaign plan I had written, complete with timestamps and my handwritten notes. She didn't know what I intended to do with it, but if needed, she was willing to confirm everything. I didn't reply right away. I moved the email to pending, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that some truths aren't meant to be exposed by discrediting others. They are better revealed through the work you continue to do. And in that moment, I knew that while the storm hadn't passed, the board had shifted. Northlight was no longer the side project of someone who had been cast aside. It had become a quiet force that made those who once misjudged me reevaluate. The people who once said I wasn't tough enough for high-stakes work, not cold enough to lead, not slick enough to retain clients, were now hearing those very clients ask, "Why isn't she working with you anymore?" And to me, that was the most beautiful twist. No exposure, no retaliation, just undeniable results that forced them to admit they had been wrong. And that acknowledgement didn't come from an article. It came from something they couldn't refute. One late winter afternoon, as the light outside the window turned a muted silver and the wind slipped through the gaps in the door like a quiet reminder of unfinished things. I received a call from a man named Marcus Reed. He introduced himself as the CEO of Hespera Studios, an independent media group expanding into social impact storytelling. His voice was low and clear, not embellished. And the first thing he said that made me pause was, "I've been following your work from a distance for some time, but unlike others who had approached me with offers that came wrapped in self-interest, Marcus was direct. We want you to lead a large-scale media project, but on your terms. No PR department control, no compromise with hollow language. We believe in the way you tell stories." I sat quietly for a moment, not from confusion, but from the strange feeling of being seen, of having someone recognize the quiet work I had always assumed only I valued. The project was called Remind, a 6-month multi-platform campaign focused on restoring trust in toxic workplaces, where real value was often sacrificed for false performance and endless internal competition. I didn't say yes immediately. Instead, I did something I had always avoided. I called the people who had hurt me, not to demand justice, but to redraw the boundaries. I asked Madison to meet at a small cafe on Crosby Street, a place we used to gather for quick pre-presentation check-ins. She arrived 15 minutes late, barefaced, visibly tired, a far cry from her usual polished self. When I looked up, she didn't pretend to be happy to see me. She simply sat down and said, "I knew this moment would come eventually." I didn't interrogate her, didn't assign blame. I told her I was preparing to return, not to prove anything, but to rebuild what should never have been broken. She lowered her head and said she once believed she had to move faster, win more, just to avoid being left behind, and in her rush, she had stepped over people like me without stopping to look. I nodded. I didn't hate her, didn't forgive her either. I just accepted a truth that we all need to hear at least once in our lives, that people sometimes do harm, not out of malice, but out of weakness in the face of ambition. After that meeting, I called Haley, the first teammate of Northlight, and told her that if she was ready. We were entering a new phase. I no longer wanted to hide behind the curtain, no longer wanted others to represent what I had built. It was time to step forward, not for applause, but to be the mirror for those who had once thought themselves too powerless to create anything meaningful. I sent my acceptance to Hespera Studios, along with a clear collaboration agreement that included full creative control, team selection rights, and the ability to withdraw if any attempt to commercialize the message arose. 3 hours later, they replied, "We agree and will support you fully." On the launch day of Remind, I stood before a new team of 12 mostly young people who had left major agencies because of moral fatigue or a lack of connection. I told them I didn't bring guarantees or promise dazzling results, only that whatever we created would never require us to be ashamed. Each week, we held internal story sessions, not brainstorming meetings, but honest conversations about times we were pushed out simply for refusing to do the wrong thing. Those stories later became the backbone of podcast episodes, short videos, and social media articles. Every Remind sub-campaign began with a forgotten truth and ended with a tangible action to make the audience feel less alone. We used no celebrities, bought no ads, and relied solely on letting the audience see themselves in every word. The result was that in just 2 months, engagement tripled our projections, and a group of companies in San Francisco began adapting our content into their internal HR training. But the most powerful shift didn't come from numbers. It came in the form of a handwritten letter delivered by mail. The sender was my mother, the same woman who once told me my job was too hard to explain to the neighbors. She wrote that she had watched the full Remind series after her grandchild shared it with her, and though she didn't understand everything I did, she felt comforted seeing me standing tall and helping others recognize their own worth. She said that if someone had done something like this for her when she was younger, maybe her life would have felt less lonely. I read that letter in my small office, where the late afternoon light streamed through the window and fell on the wall where a single line was pinned. It starts with truth. In that moment, I knew I was ready. No more doubt. No more fear that it would all fall apart again. I had come through failure not to win, but to understand that a comeback isn't about returning to where you were. It's about standing somewhere higher, stronger, and still enough to see the full picture. I don't remember the exact moment my comeback began, because it didn't arrive like fireworks or a stage suddenly lit up. It came through quiet signs like how people started pronouncing my name correctly in major meetings, how partners began asking if I had time to lead expert panels, or simply the way the younger team members looked at me when they handed me a proposal and asked, "What do you think I had spent so long believing that everything I did had to be validated through someone else before it was considered valuable?" Now, my quiet presence alone was enough to create trust that needed no introduction. Remind continued spreading beyond expectation, attracting collaborations from nonprofit organizations in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Denver. A podcast series inspired by the campaign was chosen by Spotify as a featured content of the month, and the same people who once said emotional media only suited art films were now quoting those very concepts in their own proposals. I still stayed late in the office after everyone left, not to work, but to hear how the space breathed when the pressure was gone. One evening, while editing my keynote for the Impact by Integrity conference in Los Angeles, where I'd been invited as the main speaker, I received a message from an unsaved number. It was just one line. "I know I was wrong. I just don't know how to make it right." I realized it was Madison. I didn't reply, nor did I delete it. I left the message there, like quiet proof that sometimes people don't pay for what they've done with scandal, but with the quiet panic of knowing that the reputation they once clung to has started slipping through their hands. I'd heard that Delos was facing internal crisis, with half of its senior staff leaving after a series of campaigns failed to meet KPIs. Many brands once loyal to them had begun shifting to smaller, more human firms where people were heard instead of shaped into tools. I didn't feel joy hearing that, only a quiet recognition that fairness moves slowly, but steadily. The Los Angeles conference took place in a simple hall, no elaborate lighting, no raised platform, just a wooden podium and chairs arranged in a circle. I walked up with no script, no slides, just a story to tell. I talked about the first time an idea of mine was rejected for being too emotional, about nights building slide decks with trembling hands from exhaustion, about the cold coffee in my apartment where I decided to name my dream Northlight. Even though no one believed it could take shape, I didn't name anyone. I didn't speak of betrayal. I spoke of choice, that everyone must decide whether to prove their worth through words or through results that leave nothing more to say. I ended my talk with a question. True value, is it something we hope others acknowledge, or something we keep for ourselves when every stage has gone dark? The room was silent, not from emotion, but because everyone was staring into their own reflections. Afterward, I received many collaboration offers from creative agencies, social organizations, even universities inviting me to speak about leadership in bootstrapped startups. I declined most of them, choosing carefully what truly aligned, not out of pickiness, But because I knew that expanding too quickly could send me back into the very spiral that once made me lose myself, I wanted Northlight to keep its spirit intact, small, honest, and enduring. Haley had now become our creative lead, managing projects with a calm rarely seen in someone her age. We had added 3 more members, all of whom had walked away from major agencies because they couldn't bear systems that treated people like tools. And so, one small campaign at a time, we told bigger stories of healing, of how people stand up not for applause, but for a shoulder strong enough to lean on. I kept my habit of handwriting thoughts at the end of each month in a soft gray notebook with no hardcover and no lock. In the most recent entry, I wrote, "Revenge through success isn't about making them fall. It's about making them look back and realize what they missed." And I realized I no longer needed anyone to look back. The most important thing was that I could now see myself clearly in the mirror, not as someone who had fallen, but as someone who had learned how to rise without being swept away again. As for Madison, I'd heard she was freelancing, no longer appearing at big events or topping interview lists, but beginning to teach career workshops to recent graduates. Maybe that was punishment. Maybe it was a restart. I didn't dwell on it anymore, because not all consequences come as collapse. Sometimes it's simply having to live with your real self, without any title left to hide behind. One late night, just after finishing my final online meeting, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. Just one sentence. "You don't need anyone to be proud of you, because clearly, you've made people rethink how they judge others." I sat still, the warm light casting shadows on my teacup, the street noises outside moving steadily as always, and in that moment, I understood that everything I had endured, lost, and quietly survived wasn't to earn applause. It was to preserve something no one could ever take away from me: peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing I don't need to win against anyone. I only need to never lose to myself.